The sanctuary windows exploded inward as armored officers crashed through the stained glass, their boots crunching on fragments of Jesus blessing the children. Screams erupted from the congregation as flash-bang grenades detonated between the wooden pews, white light searing through the sacred space where moments before, elderly Mrs. Washington had been humming Amazing Grace, while her granddaughter colored Bible verses in a coloring book. "Get down, everybody down now!" The tactical team's voices boomed through megaphones, drowning out the terrified sobs of children pressed against their parents' trembling bodies. Pastor Marcus Williams, still holding his worn leather Bible, raised his hands slowly as red laser dots danced across his dark suit jacket. "There must be some mistake," he began, his deep voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. "Shut up" on the ground. An officer's baton struck Marcus between his shoulder blades, sending him crashing into the communion table. The silver chalice clattered to the floor, spilling grape juice across the white cloth like blood. 15 minutes earlier, the morning had been perfect. Golden sunlight streamed through the windows of New Hope Baptist Church, illuminating dust motes that danced above the congregation's bowed heads during opening prayer. The small church, nestled in the heart of Riverside's historically black neighborhood, had been a beacon of faith for 3 generations. Pastor Marcus Williams stood behind the pulpit his grandfather had built with his own hands, leading his flock in worship with the same gentle authority that had made him beloved throughout the community. "Let us turn to Psalm 23, Marcus had said, his voice carrying easily through the intimate space. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The congregation of 47 souls, ranging from 3-month-old baby Destiny, sleeping in her mother's arms, to 92-year-old Deacon Harris, tapping his cane to the rhythm of the hymns, responded with practiced unity. This was their sanctuary, their safe haven in a world that often seemed hostile to their very existence. Sarah Mitchell, the church secretary and Marcus's childhood friend, operated the small camera that live-streamed their services for shut-in members. She had been adjusting the angle to capture the children's choir when the first police sirens wailed in the distance. No one thought much of it. Sirens were common in their neighborhood. But across the street, behind the lace curtains of her pristine 2-story colonial, Karen Whitfield was dialing 911 for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Her manicured fingers trembled with rage as she peered through her blinds at the church parking lot, where several cars had parked partially on the public street. 911, what's your emergency? This is Karen Whitfield at 847 Maple Street. I'm reporting a dangerous cult gathering at the church across from my house. There are dozens of people inside, and I've heard chanting and screaming. I believe they're planning some kind of violent attack. The dispatcher's voice remained professional, but alert. "Ma'am, can you describe what you're seeing that makes you believe there's a threat?" Karen's eyes narrowed as she watched a group of teenagers laughing together near the church entrance. They've been gathering here every Sunday for months, getting more aggressive each time. The leader, he's a tall black man. He's been preaching about resistance and fighting back. Just last week, I heard him talking about taking action and not backing down. I'm terrified they're planning something violent. None of it was true. Karen had moved to Riverside 6 months ago, drawn by the neighborhood's rising property values and its proximity to the upscale downtown district. She had expected quiet suburban living, not the vibrant community life that centered around New Hope Baptist. The church's parking situation had become her obsession. Members often parked on the street during services, and Karen had convinced herself this was a deliberate assault on her property values and peace of mind. The first confrontation had happened 3 weeks earlier. Karen had marched across the street after Sunday service, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the summer heat, wearing a crisp white blouse and navy slacks that screamed, Homeowners Association enforcer. "Excuse me," she had called to Pastor Marcus as he chatted with departing congregation members on the front steps. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge here." Marcus had turned with a warm smile, extending his hand. "Good morning. I'm Pastor Williams. How can I help you?" "Your people are parking on the street in front of my house. It's unacceptable. I pay taxes, and I have a right to park in front of my own property." The conversation had escalated quickly when Marcus politely explained that street parking was public and offered to remind his congregation to be considerate of neighbors. Karen had exploded. "Don't patronize me. I know what this is really about. You people think you can just take over this neighborhood, but I won't be intimidated." The phrase "you people" had hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Several congregation members had stopped their conversations, sensing the familiar sting of coded language they'd heard too many times before. Marcus had maintained his composure with practiced grace. "Ma'am, we've been part of this community for over 60 years. We're not trying to take over anything. We're just trying to worship in peace." But Karen was beyond reason. "Worship? I've heard the noise coming from this building. That's not worship, that's cult behavior. And I'm going to make sure the authorities know about it." She had stormed back to her house, leaving behind a congregation shaken by her venom, but not surprised by it. They'd faced worse. Much worse. Over the decades. They'd weathered cross burnings in the 1960s, bomb threats in the 1970s, and countless acts of vandalism. They knew how to endure. What they hadn't expected was Karen's escalating campaign of harassment. She had started with noise complaints to the city, claiming the church's services exceeded decibel limits. When those were dismissed, New Hope's services were no louder than any other church. She had reported them for zoning violations, fire code infractions, and suspicious financial activity. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but Karen's frustration only grew. She began taking photos of congregation members, following some to their cars, demanding to know their names and addresses. She called the police about suspicious gatherings whenever church members met for Bible study or community events. The breaking point came on a sweltering July morning when Karen discovered that 3 church members had parked in front of her house during a funeral service. The deceased was Mother Ruby Thompson, a beloved community matriarch who had taught Sunday school for 47 years. The church was packed beyond capacity, with overflow parking extending down the entire block. As mourners filed past Ruby's casket, sharing memories and tears, Karen emerged from her house with a stack of orange traffic cones. She placed them aggressively in front of each car, then began photographing license plates while shouting at anyone who looked in her direction. "This is private property access. You're all trespassing," she screamed at elderly church members dressed in their funeral finest. When Marcus approached her, hoping to de-escalate the situation during such a sacred moment, Karen's mask completely slipped. "Don't come near me. You cult leader, I know what you're really doing in there, brainwashing these people, teaching them to hate white people like me. But I see through your religious act. You're nothing but a con artist, using your so-called church to spread hate." The accusation was so outrageous, so divorced from reality, that Marcus was momentarily speechless. Behind him, Mother Ruby's great-granddaughter began to cry, not understanding why the nice lady from across the street was yelling at Grandpa Marcus during Nana's going-home service. "Ma'am, please. We're trying to bury our dead with dignity. I'm asking you, as one human being to another, to show some respect." But Karen was past the point of hearing. "Respect. You want respect? Then stop turning this neighborhood into your personal compound. Stop filling these people's heads with dangerous ideas about fighting back and resistance. I've heard your sermons, and I know what you're really preaching." She hadn't heard his sermons. She'd never set foot inside New Hope Baptist Church. But in her mind, she'd constructed an elaborate fantasy where Marcus was some kind of radical extremist, where the sweet, elderly ladies who brought him casseroles were dangerous cultists, where the children's choir was actually a training ground for violence. The funeral had proceeded despite her disruption, but something fundamental had shifted. The congregation began to feel unsafe in their own sanctuary. Parents started walking their children to their cars after services. The elderly members looked over their shoulders when they arrived for Wednesday night Bible study. Karen's delusions deepened with each passing week. She installed security cameras pointed directly at the church, claiming she needed to document their activities. She started a neighborhood Facebook group called Riverside Safety Watch and filled it with paranoid rants about the dangerous elements at New Hope Baptist. Most neighbors ignored her, but a few began to listen. Fear was contagious, especially fear wrapped in the language of community safety and property values. Karen's posts became increasingly elaborate, describing secret meetings, suspicious visitors, and ominous conversations she claimed to have overheard. The truth was much simpler and infinitely more beautiful. New Hope Baptist was exactly what it appeared to be: a small, loving congregation trying to serve God and their community. They ran a food pantry that fed anyone who was hungry, regardless of race or religion. They provided after-school tutoring for neighborhood children. They visited the sick, comforted the grieving, and celebrated life's joys together. Pastor Marcus's sermons were indeed about resistance, resisting despair, resisting hatred, resisting the temptation to respond to evil with evil. He preached about fighting back against injustice through love, through community organizing, through voting and peaceful advocacy. When he talked about not backing down, he meant not backing down from their commitment to love their neighbors, even the ones who seemed determined to hate them. But Karen heard only what her fear wanted her to hear. Every call for justice became a threat of violence in her mind. Every song about overcoming became a battle cry. Every expression of Black pride and resilience became anti-white hatred. So, on that Sunday morning in August, when parking was particularly tight due to a special baptism service, Karen made the call that would shatter everything. Her voice shook with manufactured terror as she described an imminent terrorist attack brewing in the small brick church across the street. The 911 dispatcher, trained to take all threats seriously, immediately activated the tactical response team. Within minutes, the quiet Sunday morning exploded into chaos. Now, as armored officers zip-tied the hands of terrified worshipers, Karen watched from her window with a mixture of satisfaction and growing unease. This wasn't quite what she had expected. She had wanted the church shut down, the congregation scattered, the neighborhood returned to her vision of suburban tranquility. She hadn't really thought through what a terrorist raid would actually look like. Baby Destiny was screaming as her mother, Keisha, was forced face down onto the carpet, her sundress riding up as an officer pressed his knee between her shoulder blades. Deacon Harris, the 92-year-old pillar of the church, was trying to explain his heart condition to officers who were shouting at him to move faster. 8-year-old Jamal was hyperventilating as he watched his grandfather being handcuffed, not understanding why the police were treating Grandpa like a criminal. "Please, you're scaring the children," Sarah Mitchell pleaded, as she held her hands up, her Livestream camera still running, broadcasting the horror to viewers who had tuned in expecting a peaceful Sunday service. An officer knocked the camera from her hands, but it continued recording from the floor, capturing a sideways view of boots, scattered hymnals, and the terrified faces of people whose only crime was gathering to worship. Pastor Marcus, his cheek pressed against the cold floor, tried to process what was happening. "Officer, I'm Pastor Williams. This is a church service. There must be some mistake. Save it for the interrogation room. Preacher, we know all about your little operation here." The team leader's voice carried absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that came from being told by dispatch that they were dealing with imminent terrorism. As congregation members were loaded into police vans, their shocked faces pressed against tinted windows, Karen felt her first flicker of doubt. Mrs. Washington, the grandmother who always waved at her while working in her garden, was crying silently as she was led away in handcuffs. The teenager, who sometimes offered to carry her groceries, was curled in a ball on the van floor, his mother trying desperately to comfort him, despite being restrained herself. These didn't look like terrorists. They looked like neighbors, people, human beings whose lives she had just destroyed with a phone call. But Karen pushed the doubt away. She had been right to call. The neighborhood was safer now. Property values would recover. She had done what needed to be done. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Within hours, it became clear that New Hope Baptist Church posed no threat to anyone. The weapons Karen had described in her follow-up calls turned out to be musical instruments and folding chairs. The bomb-making materials were supplies for the Vacation Bible School craft project construction paper, glue sticks, and glitter. The terrorist leader was a man with a doctorate in divinity, 3 decades of community service, and a spotless criminal record. His radical teachings were traditional Christian sermons about love, forgiveness, and social justice. The cult members were teachers, nurses, mechanics, students, and retirees, whose greatest crime was believing they had the right to worship without fear. But the damage was done. The images of churchgoers being dragged from their sanctuary had spread across social media like wildfire. The Livestream footage, captured from Sarah's fallen camera, showed the world exactly what had happened: a peaceful congregation terrorized by armed officers responding to a false report. Dr. Angela Thompson, a civil rights attorney and Mother Ruby's granddaughter, arrived at the police station before the last congregation member was released. She had been in court when the raid happened, only learning about it when her assistant burst into her office with the news that her childhood church was under siege. "I want every single person released immediately," she demanded, her usually composed demeanor cracking with fury. "And I want to know exactly who made the call that led to this travesty." The police chief, visibly shaken by the realization of what had occurred on his watch, assured her that the investigation would be thorough and transparent. "Dr. Thompson, I want you to know that this is not who we are as a department. We responded to what we believed was a credible threat, but it's clear we were deliberately misled. Chief Morrison, you had 47 innocent people, including children and elderly citizens, terrorized in their place of worship, based on the word of one person who clearly had an agenda. That's not just a mistake, that's a failure of basic police work." As the truth emerged, the community's shock turned to outrage. The video footage was damning not just of Karen's false accusations, but of how quickly law enforcement had been willing to believe the worst about a black congregation. Social media exploded with commentary, much of it focusing on how different the response might have been if someone had called in a similar report about a white church. Local news stations picked up the story, then national outlets. The footage of elderly churchgoers being handcuffed during communion became a symbol of everything wrong with both racial profiling and the weaponization of 911 calls by hostile neighbors. Karen, meanwhile, had locked herself in her house as news vans began gathering on Maple Street. She had unplugged her phone after the third call from reporters asking for comment, and she was refusing to answer her door. Through her blinds, She could see protesters beginning to gather, not violent or threatening, but a steady stream of community members holding signs that read, "Justice for New Hope" and "Worship is not a crime." The investigation into Karen's motives revealed a troubling pattern. Police records showed her escalating complaints against the church, her harassment of congregation members, and her increasingly unhinged social media posts. The FBI was brought in to investigate whether her false report constituted a hate crime, and the district attorney began considering charges of filing false reports, reckless endangerment, and terroristic threats. But the legal consequences were only part of Karen's growing nightmare. The story had made national news, and her name and face were now known across the country. The neighborhood Facebook group she had created to spread fear about New Hope Baptist was flooded with thousands of comments from outraged citizens condemning her actions. Her employer, a local real estate company, announced they were conducting a review of her employment status. Most devastating of all, Karen was beginning to realize that she had been wrong. Completely, utterly, catastrophically wrong. As she watched the news coverage, she saw congregation members. She recognized the woman who had returned her lost dog, the teenager who cleared snow from elderly neighbors' driveways, the man who had helped her carry groceries when she twisted her ankle. These weren't the dangerous cultists of her imagination. They were the best of her community, and she had destroyed their sense of safety and belonging with her lies. The midpoint of Karen's reckoning came when she discovered something that shattered her remaining delusions entirely. While nervously scrolling through local news coverage, she stumbled upon a feature article about Pastor Marcus that had been published just a month before her first complaint. The article detailed his work with the police department's community liaison program, his efforts to build bridges between law enforcement and residents, and his success in reducing youth crime in the area through mentorship and job training programs. There were photos of him at police appreciation dinners, quotes from officers praising his cooperation, and testimonials from young people whose lives he had changed for the better. The man she had portrayed as an anti-police radical was actually one of the department's most valued community partners. The church she had described as a threat to neighborhood safety was literally making the neighborhood safer through its programs and outreach. But perhaps most damning was a photo from the previous Christmas, showing Pastor Marcus and several congregation members delivering meals to elderly shut-ins. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Karen's own house. She remembered that day she had been sick with the flu, and someone had left a container of homemade soup on her porch with a note that said, "Hope you feel better soon. From your neighbors at New Hope." She had thrown the soup away, assuming it was some kind of trick or attempt to poison her. Now she realized it had been an act of genuine kindness from the people she was systematically trying to destroy. The weight of her actions crashed down on her like an avalanche. She had not just filed a false police report, she had weaponized the trauma of racism and police violence against the very people who had tried to show her kindness. She had turned the sanctity of worship into a scene of terror for people who had already endured centuries of persecution. As the days passed, the consequences multiplied. The real estate company fired her, citing conduct incompatible with our values of community and respect. Her homeowner's insurance received notice of potential lawsuits from multiple congregation members seeking damages for emotional distress and trauma. The FBI informed her that she was under federal investigation for potential hate crime charges. Most painfully, her own family began to distance themselves from her. Her sister in California called, her voice shaking with shame and disappointment. "Karen, I've been getting calls all day from friends who saw the news. They're asking me if you're really my sister, if this is really what our family raised you to be. I don't know what to tell them, because I don't recognize the person in these news reports." The climax of the community's response came 2 weeks after the raid. when New Hope Baptist announced they would hold a special service of healing and reconciliation. The event was planned as both a response to the trauma they had endured and an opportunity for the broader community to show support. Word spread quickly, and by Sunday morning, the small church was surrounded by hundreds of supporters. Other congregations, community organizations, local politicians, and ordinary citizens came to stand with New Hope Baptist. The crowd was diverse: Black, white, Latino, Asian, young, old, representing every faith tradition and walk of life in Riverside. Karen watched from her window as the peaceful gathering grew throughout the morning. She had received legal advice to stay inside, avoid media contact, and prepare for the possibility of criminal charges. But as she saw the genuine outpouring of love and support for the people she had wronged, her isolation became unbearable. Against her lawyer's explicit instructions, Karen made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She walked out of her house, across the street, and into the crowd surrounding New Hope Baptist Church. The reaction was immediate and intense. People recognized her instantly. Her face had been on the news for weeks. Some shouted in anger. Others simply stared in shock. A few moved protectively in front of children, as if her presence alone was a threat. "What is she doing here?" someone called out. "She has some nerve showing her face," another voice added. But Pastor Marcus, who was greeting supporters near the church entrance, saw her approach and did something that no one expected. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable, as the crowd fell silent. Karen stopped a few feet away from him, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Pastor Williams, I need to tell you something." The crowd pressed closer, phones raised to record whatever was about to happen. Local news cameras turned in their direction, sensing that this moment would define the entire story. "I was wrong." The words came out in a rush, as if she was afraid she would lose the courage to say them. "I was completely, horribly wrong about everything. About you. About your church. About your people. I let fear and prejudice turn me into someone I don't recognize. I destroyed your peace. I traumatized your children. I turned your place of worship into a war zone, and I have no excuse for any of it." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she continued, "I know you have no reason to forgive me. I know I've caused damage that can't be undone, but I needed you to know that I see the truth now, and I am so sorry." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. The crowd waited to see how Pastor Marcus would respond to this public confession from the woman who had caused so much pain. When he spoke, his voice carried the same gentle authority that had comforted his congregation through decades of joy and sorrow. "Ms. Whitfield, what you did to my congregation, to our children, to our elders, was deeply wrong. You could have gotten people killed with your lies. You traumatized people who welcomed you as a neighbor and tried to show you kindness." Karen nodded, unable to speak through her tears. "But," Marcus continued, "if you're truly sorry, if you truly understand the harm you've caused, then there's hope for healing, not just for you, but for all of us. Because hate wins when we refuse to believe that people can change, when we decide that redemption is impossible." He paused, looking out at the crowd that was hanging on his every word. The Bible teaches us that confession is the first step toward restoration. Ms. Whitfield has confessed publicly. The question now is what she's willing to do to make amends for the damage she's caused. Over the following months, Karen would discover exactly what making amends required. The legal consequences were severe. She was charged with filing false reports, reckless endangerment, and federal hate crime violations. She pled guilty to all charges, accepting a sentence that included substantial fines, community service, and a permanent restraining order keeping her away from New Hope Baptist Church and its members. The civil lawsuits were even more devastating. The congregation's trauma was real and documented children suffering from nightmares, elderly members afraid to attend services, parents unable to concentrate at work due to anxiety and hypervigilance. Karen's insurance covered some of the damages, but she was forced to sell her house to pay the remainder. More importantly, she was required to undergo extensive counseling to address the racial prejudice and paranoid thinking that had led to her actions. The process was painful and humbling, forcing her to confront not just what she had done, but why she had been so eager to believe the worst about her black neighbors. The community healing process was longer and more complex. New Hope Baptist installed new security measures and began offering trauma counseling for affected members. Several congregation members struggled with feeling safe in their own sanctuary, and some left the church entirely, unable to overcome the association with that terrible Sunday morning. But there were also signs of hope and growth. The incident had brought national attention to the church's community programs, resulting in increased donations and volunteer support. Other congregations reached out to build relationships and offer solidarity. The interfaith response became a model for other communities dealing with similar conflicts. Pastor Marcus used the experience as a teaching moment, preaching about the dangers of weaponizing 911 calls, the importance of getting to know one's neighbors, and the difference between accountability and revenge. We have a choice, he told his congregation one Sunday several months later. We can let hatred consume us, or we can use this pain to build something better. Ms. Whitfield caused tremendous harm, but our response to that harm will define who we are, more than what she did to us. The broader community also learned important lessons. Local police implemented new protocols for responding to calls about religious gatherings, requiring additional verification before deploying tactical teams. The 911 dispatch system added questions designed to identify potentially biased or harassment-motivated calls. Neighborhood associations began offering conflict resolution training to help residents address disputes before they escalated to false emergency reports. Karen, meanwhile, found herself starting over in a new city, her old life destroyed by her own actions. The public nature of her confession had made her unemployable in Riverside, and the legal restrictions meant she could never return to her former home. She was working a series of low-paying jobs, living in a small apartment, and attending weekly therapy sessions to address the prejudices that had led to her downfall. But she was also volunteering at a community center that served immigrants and refugees, trying to understand the fear and displacement she had caused others to feel. She was reading books about racism and bias, attending workshops on conflict resolution, and slowly beginning to understand how her actions fit into larger patterns of harm. It would take years for her to fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had done, and even longer for her to become someone worthy of the forgiveness Pastor Marcus had offered that day. But the possibility remained, not because she deserved it, but because forgiveness was about healing the community, not just punishing the wrongdoer. New Hope Baptist Church continued to thrive, their faith strengthened rather than shaken by the ordeal they had endured. The empty lot where Karen's house had stood was eventually purchased by the church and converted into a community garden where neighbors of all backgrounds came together to grow food for the local food pantry. On quiet Sunday mornings, when golden light again streamed through the repaired stained glass windows, Pastor Marcus sometimes looked out at the garden and reflected on how hate had been transformed into something life-giving. The soil that had been poisoned by prejudice now grew vegetables that fed hungry families throughout Riverside. It wasn't a perfect ending. Some wounds never fully healed. Some trust could never be completely restored. But it was a true ending, one that acknowledged both the real harm caused by Karen's actions and the real possibility of redemption through genuine repentance and community support. The children of New Hope Baptist still sang in the choir, their voices rising through the sanctuary windows to bless a neighborhood that had learned, through pain and grace, how to be more than the sum of its fears. And in that music was the promise that hate, no matter how loud or destructive, would never have the final word in a community determined to choose love over fear, understanding over suspicion, and healing over revenge. The story of Karen Whitfield and New Hope Baptist Church became a case study in how quickly fear could destroy community bonds and how much work was required to rebuild them. But it also became a testament to the power of accountability, genuine repentance, and the kind of forgiveness that doesn't excuse harm, but insists that transformation is possible. In the end, the sanctuary stood stronger than before, its congregation more aware of both the fragility and the resilience of their beloved community. The stained glass windows, repaired with new pieces that caught the light differently than the originals, served as a reminder that broken things could be made beautiful again, not by ignoring the cracks, but by filling them with something precious that would never allow them to break the same way twice.